Under the glittering chandeliers of Delmonico's, one kiss shattered the silence of a cruel ballroom. Society called her a spinster, mocked her dignity and laughed at her solitude, until a steel magnate silenced the ridicule with a gesture that would change both their lives forever. But was it compassion, defiance, or a desire neither of them could yet name? In a world where whispers could build or destroy, Louisa Whitcombe and Jonathan Blackwell would be forced to choose between pride and passion, between society's judgment and the dangerous truth of their hearts. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe love can defy the weight of society's expectations? New York City, January of the year 1882. The snow had settled like lace over the rooftops of Fifth Avenue, muffling the world outside while inside Delmonico's. The air shimmered with candlelight, perfume, and expectation. The great ballroom, gilded, towering, opulent, had never looked more splendid. Crimson velvet drapes framed the arched windows, while dozens of chandeliers cast a golden glow upon silk skirts and diamond-studded coiffures. The orchestra played a delicate waltz, but beneath the music pulsed something sharper: envy, ambition, and the cold judgment of high society. Louisa Whitcombe stood at the edge of the room, wrapped in a gown of dove-grey silk that once belonged to her mother. The fabric had been altered carefully, its seams refitted by Louisa's own hand. She wore no jewels except a slender pearl pin at her throat. Elegant, yes, but insufficient in a sea of rubies and sapphires. Her chestnut-brown hair was swept into a modest chignon, her gloved hands clasped in front of her as though she could physically shield herself from the glares and whispers. She had come only because her mother insisted, and because she had no choice. Across the ballroom, Clara Davenport twirled like a blooming rose in a pale pink gown trimmed with imported French lace. Barely 23, and the daughter of one of New York's newest railway barons, Clara was everything society adored. Young, beautiful, and cruel in that effortless way the privileged often were. Her laughter, sharp and silvery, cut through the air like broken glass as she leaned toward her circle of admirers. "She looks like she's wearing the past," Clara said, her voice perfectly pitched to travel. "Poor Miss Whitcombe. Perhaps she's hoping someone will mistake her for a ghost and finally offer her a dance." The circle erupted in muffled chuckles, and Louisa, though she did not turn, felt the burn of every eye. Her cheeks flamed, but she held her chin aloft. She would not retreat. Not again. One of the matrons nearby shifted uncomfortably, murmuring something about kindness, but no one intervened. They never did. Louisa had become a fixture, like a faded portrait on a grand wall, acknowledged but unseen, passed over but never removed. And yet, somewhere beyond the perfume and laughter, someone had seen everything. Jonathan Blackwell had been observing from the shadows of the colonnade, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He stood tall in a tailored black tailcoat, a dark sapphire waistcoat beneath, and a silk cravat knotted precisely at his throat. His steel-grey eyes, framed by lashes too dark for a man of business, had not strayed from Louisa since her arrival. He had noticed the dress, yes, but more so the way she wore it, with dignity, with stillness, like a woman who knew the weight of her own presence. He was not a man given to impulsive displays. In boardrooms and banks, he was feared for his cold decisiveness. He built his empire on steel, on strategy, on silence. But something about Louisa Whitcombe, her isolation, her refusal to cower, stirred in him a heat he had not felt in years. And when Clara Davenport lifted her hand, pointing in mock pity toward Louisa, when the laughter turned vicious, something broke in him. A lifetime of restraint crumbled in a single moment. He moved across the ballroom with the smooth precision of a man who commanded attention. Conversations paused. A path opened between gowns and coattails as Jonathan Blackwell, wealthiest widower in New York, master of steel and silence, strode toward the woman no one would claim. Louisa did not see him at first. She was focused on the far wall, willing her breath to steady. But then she felt it, the hush, the shift in the room's rhythm. She turned, and there he was. Without a word, he took her gloved hand and raised it slowly to his lips. The kiss was not rushed, nor overly chaste. It was deliberate, as though he was sealing a pact not with her, but with the room itself. When he lowered her hand, his eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. A question, a challenge, a recognition. Gasps followed like ripples in a pond. Murmurs swelled. A matron dropped her fan. Clara's face drained of colour. Louisa's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded, not from the scandal, but from the look in his eyes. Clear, unreadable, intense. She tried to speak, but the words tangled. She had never shared a word with this man. And yet in that moment he had altered the course of her life with the lightest touch of his mouth to her glove. He bowed slightly. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, voice low and steady. She could only nod. Then he turned, and as swiftly as he had arrived, he disappeared back into the crowd. The orchestra resumed. The room exhaled, but nothing would be the same. Louisa remained standing, hands still tingling, mind spinning. She could feel the eyes, the whispers, the calculations taking root in every corner of that chandeliered cage. They would wonder, they would speculate. But she would remember the look in his eyes, not of pity, but of purpose. That night, society did not forget Louisa Whitcombe. And Louisa Whitcombe would never forget the man who stopped the laughter with a kiss. The morning after the Delmonico's gala, New York awoke with frost clinging to its rooftops and scandal shimmering in its headlines. Printed in thick black type on the front page of the Social Gazette was a headline that made Louisa Whitcombe's name, for the first time in over a decade, the subject of fascination rather than pity. Steel magnate Blackwell claims forgotten heiress with daring kiss at Delmonico's. Louisa sat rigidly at the breakfast table, her gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly as she read the article aloud. The words struck like cold rain, each sentence turning an impulsive moment into a spectacle dissected by strangers. The text danced with implications. The kiss that stunned society, an unexpected pairing. Will the widow king of industry make an honest woman of Miss Whitcombe? Across from her, in a high-backed chair upholstered in fading brocade, sat her mother, Mrs. Honoria Whitcombe, her posture stiff as starched linen, her expression unreadable. Her widow's cap cast a netted shadow over her pale features, but her voice cut cleanly through the silence. "Well, at last," she said, folding her hands with deliberate grace. "Someone has remembered you exist." Louisa looked up sharply, the paper still clutched between her fingers. "Mother, please." Honoria lifted one elegant brow. "I am not mocking you, Louisa. I am stating the facts. You are 32, unmarried, with no dowry to speak of. The world has made its judgments. And yet, by some divine comedy or miracle, or perhaps something more calculated, you now find yourself whispered about over breakfast tables from Fifth Avenue to Murray Hill." Louisa's chest tightened. It was only a kiss, nothing more. "A kiss from Jonathan Blackwell," Honoria replied, leaning forward. "The man could purchase a seat in the Senate with his loose change. That kiss may be the only opportunity left to you." Louisa stood abruptly, the hem of her modest morning dress brushing the parquet floor. The room, with its tall windows and pale wallpaper, suddenly felt too small. "An opportunity for what, exactly?" she asked, voice low. "To become the subject of jokes in new circles, to be passed from obscurity to spectacle, like a bauble that's been dusted off and placed back in the shop window." Her mother's gaze did not falter. "To marry, Louisa, and secure your place in this world before it forgets you altogether." Louisa turned toward the window. Outside, the iron gate of their townhouse stood laced in snow, as silent and cold as the life they had both come to accept. She did not want to be forgotten, but neither did she wish to be bartered. At that very hour, Across the city, in his study at the Blackwell estate, a house twice as grand and twice as empty, Jonathan sat in a winged leather chair, staring at the same headline. The fire at his back crackled softly, but his mind was a roar. He had not planned it, that he knew with certainty. And yet, now that the moment had passed, it seemed inevitable. As if the pressure of that room, the cruelty in Clara Davenport's voice, the unbearable silence from everyone else, had made the kiss not only instinctive, but necessary. His secretary, a pale man named Herrick, cleared his throat delicately. "The stockholders are concerned," he said, without lifting his eyes from the notes he held. "The board is already wondering whether this display was a signal." Jonathan's voice was clipped. "A signal of what?" Herrick hesitated. "That you've chosen to align yourself, socially or financially, with the Whitcombes." Jonathan's expression darkened. "The Whitcombes own nothing but fading wallpaper and gossip. No one aligns themselves with a ruin, Herrick." Herrick inclined his head, but his thin mouth twitched. "Then perhaps they are wondering why a man as deliberate as yourself would act with such recklessness. Unless it was calculated," Jonathan finished for him, rising from his chair. He crossed to the window, his boots silent on the thick carpet. The city stretched below, carriages moving like beetles along the snow-lined avenues, chimneys sending plumes of smoke into the pale sky. Somewhere Louisa Whitcombe was reading the same article, enduring the same storm. He had not meant to change her life, and yet, somehow he had. His hands clenched behind his back. He could command steel, build bridges, bend men to his will with numbers and silence, but that woman, with her proud chin and eyes that spoke of rooms full of laughter long gone, she had looked at him with neither gratitude nor fear, only confusion, and something else he could not name. Later that afternoon, a card arrived at the Whitcombe residence. Embossed with stark simplicity, it read, "Mr. Jonathan Blackwell requests the pleasure of calling on Miss Louisa Whitcombe at 4 o'clock. Her mother nearly dropped her teacup. "He intends to call? Today?" Louisa felt her pulse quicken. "I don't know what he intends." At precisely 4 o'clock, a knock came. Jonathan Blackwell entered not like a conqueror, but like a man who knew he did not belong among faded grandeur and worn carpets. He wore a charcoal frock coat, his gloves removed and folded neatly in one hand. His presence was exact, composed, and entirely out of place in the narrow drawing-room that still smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Louisa rose as he entered, her spine straight despite the flutter in her chest. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Whitcombe." Their eyes met. No curtsy, no bow, just a heavy silence full of words that refused to be spoken first. "I owe you an explanation," he said after a moment. "You owe me nothing," she replied, though her voice wavered. "But I suspect you came to give one anyway." He gave a faint smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. "You're not a fool, Miss Whitcombe. You know what that kiss has done." "Yes," she said softly. "It has made me visible, but not necessarily real." He took a step closer. "Society will speak regardless, but we can shape what it says." Louisa's brow furrowed. "You propose what exactly?" "A courtship, public, polite, convenient for us both." She swallowed hard. "Convenient for you, perhaps. I am not a pawn in a business strategy, Mr. Blackwell." "No," he said more quietly. "You're not." Their gazes locked once more, and in that fragile silence, something shifted, unspoken, delicate, charged. A recognition of two people used to navigating power and loneliness in equal measure. Jonathan's voice dropped. "I don't offer affection, not yet, but I offer you the truth. I couldn't watch them laugh at you, and I cannot undo what I've started." Louisa's reply was a whisper. "Then let us both be careful what we begin." He nodded, then stepped back, offering a short bow. "I shall return on Sunday, with your permission." She inclined her head. "You have it." He turned, and with the same quiet control with which he had arrived, he left. Louisa remained standing long after the door closed. The silence felt different now, no longer hollow but expectant. Outside, the frost began to melt along the windows. But inside her, something far more dangerous had begun to stir. The parlour of the Whitcombe residence had never known such stillness. The flicker of gaslight danced upon the faded floral wallpaper, and the air, though scented faintly of dried lavender, held the weight of unspoken tension. Outside, the clatter of hooves on Fifth Avenue echoed distantly through the windows, muffled by velvet drapes. Yet within, time had slowed to the delicate rhythm of restrained breath and reluctant formality. Louisa sat upright on the edge of the settee, her gloved hands resting lightly atop her skirts. She wore a walking dress of deep forest green wool, modest in cut but refined in detail, her only nod to the occasion. A velvet ribbon encircled her collar, clasped with a small cameo that had belonged to her grandmother. Her chestnut hair had been twisted into a smooth coil at the base of her neck, not in an effort to impress, but to conceal the unease that pulsed just beneath her composure. Across from her stood Jonathan Blackwell, once again immaculately dressed in a three-piece suit of midnight blue, his waistcoat embroidered subtly in silver thread, his posture straight as iron. He had removed his gloves upon entering, and now held them in one hand, his fingers flexing as though suppressing the instinct to grasp control over the conversation that hung between them. "Thank you for receiving me again," he said at last, his voice low, calm, and as deliberate as every movement he made. Louisa inclined her head. "You are our guest, Mr. Blackwell. It would have been unseemly to refuse you." There was a trace of sharpness in her tone, a defense built from years of watching the world pass her by without invitation. Jonathan noticed it but said nothing. "I will be direct," he continued. "The events at Delmonico's have taken a life of their own. The press has made a spectacle of it, and society follows the scent of scandal like bloodhounds." Louisa's gaze held his steadily. "So I've gathered. I propose," he said, stepping forward just slightly, "that we give them something more palatable to speak of, a courtship, public, visible, but manageable, for both our sakes." She lifted a brow. "Manageable, a shield," he clarified, "for you against their whispers, for me against the manipulations of those who see my personal affairs as leverage in business." His voice remained cool, but there was a flicker of something beneath it. Weariness, perhaps, or tightly leashed regret. Louisa was silent for a long moment. Her heart beat steadily but not quietly. She searched his expression, not for deceit, but for purpose. What kind of man offered protection not as affection, but as negotiation? And what kind of woman accepted such terms? "Is that what I am to you?" she asked softly. "A shield?" His jaw tightened slightly, but his answer came without delay. "No. You are a woman who did not cower when others expected you to. That is not something I can say of many." She turned her face slightly, hiding the emotion that threatened to flicker through her carefully held expression. "And yet," she murmured, "you ask me to play a part in a fiction." Jonathan moved to the fireplace and rested one hand on the marble mantel, his back half turned to her. "There is truth in appearances, Miss Whitcombe. Society accepts what it can understand. If we offer them something they can name, they will cease trying to define it themselves." There was a silence then, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Louisa rose slowly, her voice even but quiet. "Very well." He turned to face her again. "I will agree," she said, "to this alliance. But let me be clear, I will not be paraded nor patronized. If you expect me to smile beside you while you conduct this performance, you will find me a poor actress." Their eyes met fully now, steel against ice, neither yielding. "I expect nothing but your honesty," Jonathan replied, "and perhaps your patience." "Then we are evenly matched," she answered. He gave a slight bow. "Shall I send a carriage tomorrow?" Louisa hesitated. "I prefer to walk, but I suspect the weather will not permit it." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, though not quite. "Then I shall call for you at 10. She nodded. "We are agreed." And thus, with no ceremony and no affection, the arrangement was made. The following morning brought a sky of pale grey, with snow still crusting the edges of the avenues. The Blackwell carriage, a black landau with understated silver trim, waited precisely at 10 o'clock in front of the Whitcombe townhouse. Jonathan stepped out as Louisa descended the stone steps, offering his hand without flourish. She accepted it, her gloved fingers brushing his, warmth beneath leather brief and unsteady. Inside the carriage, the seats were upholstered in dark green velvet, the windows polished to clarity. Jonathan sat opposite her, the space between them taut with unspoken thought. The wheels began to turn, and the streets of New York drifted past. Towering brownstones, uniformed nannies, the first crocuses beginning to peek through the frost in Central Park, but neither spoke at first. At last, Louisa turned her head toward the window. "Where are we going?" "To the Metropolitan Club," he said. "They've opened their new conservatory to members and guests. I thought it suitably public for an outing." She looked at him then, one brow arched. "And do you intend to parade me past your rivals like a prize tulip?" Jonathan exhaled slowly. "You misunderstand me." "Do I?" He leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering. "This is not a game for me, Miss Whitcombe. I know the cost of reputation. I have built mine on precision, on control. What I did that night was not in my plans." Louisa held his gaze, and her voice, when it came, was softer than before. "Then why did you do it?" He did not answer immediately. The city passed outside the glass in a blur of movement and color. "I saw the way they looked at you," he said finally, "and I could not bear it." The carriage rocked gently beneath them, and Louisa's breath caught. Not for what he had said, but for how he had said it, without artifice, without defense. A silence fell again, but it was no longer cold. When they arrived at the Metropolitan Club, the doorman tipped his hat, and the guests within turned their heads. They were received not as an oddity, but as something far more dangerous, a possibility. Louisa walked beside Jonathan with her chin high, her stride measured, her gown swaying softly with each step. As they entered the glass-walled conservatory filled with exotic palms and fountains, he offered her his arm. She hesitated, and then delicately took it. The touch was light, but the sensation was startling. Two people, strangers in so many ways, now bound by a performance that threatened to become more than either intended. An alliance forged not in affection, but in necessity. And yet, as they moved through the curious gazes and whispered speculation, neither noticed how often their eyes returned to one another, or how, in that endless dance of appearances, something real had begun to stir. Winter had begun to retreat, but the chill of New York society lingered like frost clinging stubbornly to the corners of the avenue. In the grand parlors of the elite, where violins sang softly beneath gaslit sconces and crystal decanters caught the light like fire, the name Louisa Whitcombe once again stirred curiosity and calculation. She had not been sought after in years. Invitations had grown sparse and cold after her 25th birthday, and for a time her presence at social functions had been considered more an obligation than a pleasure. But now, with Jonathan Blackwell at her side and whispers blooming in every corridor, those same doors had flung themselves open once more. Each day brought a new card, embossed and scented, beckoning her to teas, musicales, lectures, and dinners. Most arrived from women who had once looked through her as if she were made of glass, now hoping for proximity to the unfolding intrigue. They did not seek friendship. They sought spectacle. They wished to observe the dance of the improbable romance between the steel magnate and the forgotten heiress. Louisa accepted the invitations with a serenity that belied the whirlwind within her. She knew what was expected: elegance without presumption, grace without defiance. And yet, each time she entered a room, heads turned not with pity but with something far more dangerous: interest. Jonathan accompanied her to the most significant gatherings, always precise, always composed. His presence beside her acted as both shield and fire. The moment he entered a room, conversation shifted, and Louisa felt the heat of 100 unspoken questions burning against her back. She said little in public, but her silence had weight now. A mystery that intrigued more than any flirtation ever could. The most anticipated of all invitations came in the form of ivory parchment sealed with a crimson crest. Mrs. Caroline Astor requests the pleasure of Miss Louisa Whitcombe's company at a private gathering on the evening of March the 3rd. It was not a ball. It was something far more exclusive, a seated salon of only the most carefully curated individuals, where reputations were made or erased with a glance. Louisa read the card twice before showing it to her mother, who pressed a hand to her chest as though the ink itself had startled her. "She has acknowledged you," Honoria whispered, her voice trembling between awe and disbelief. "You cannot refuse." Louisa did not intend to. She knew exactly what it meant. On the evening of the event, she dressed not as someone trying to reclaim lost youth, but as a woman who had lived in silence and chosen to speak at last. Her gown was midnight blue satin, trimmed in silver threading that caught the candlelight like starlight. The bodice was modest, with a square neckline edged in lace, and the skirt fell in long, clean lines that moved like water as she walked. Around her throat she wore a single strand of pearls, elegant, dignified, undeniable. Jonathan met her in the front hall of her home, his eyes lingering on her not with hunger, but something far more unsettling, reverence. He extended his arm, and she placed her hand gently upon it. The warmth between them was a current neither could name, but both had begun to feel. Mrs. Astor's residence on Fifth Avenue was a temple of marble and velvet, her drawing rooms adorned with European tapestries, gilded mirrors, and porcelain vases imported from France. A footman announced them with quiet formality. Mr. Jonathan Blackwell, Miss Louisa Whitcombe. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Then the buzz began, soft, urgent, persistent. Mrs. Astor herself stood near the fireplace, dressed in rich plum silk and crowned with a diamond brooch that had once belonged to her grandmother. Her expression, as always, was impassive. She extended her gloved hand. "Miss Whitcombe," she said evenly, "I'm pleased you accepted my invitation." Louisa curtsied with perfect control. "The honor is mine, madam." Mrs. Astor's gaze lingered only a moment before turning away, her approval neither voiced nor denied, but the nod she offered as she passed was witnessed by all, and that was enough. Louisa had been received. Jonathan led her to a small seating area near the conservatory doors, where a circle of ladies already nestled upon embroidered settees. Among them, Clara Davenport perched like a golden finch in a gown of pale rose, her hair curled and pinned with ribbons that trailed like silk petals down her back. Her smile was sweet, too sweet. "Well, if it isn't our modern Cinderella," Clara said, her voice light but barbed. "Come to steal hearts and headlines alike." The other ladies chuckled politely, their eyes flicking between Louisa and Jonathan. Louisa's back remained straight, her hands folded gently in her lap. "I assure you, Miss Davenport," she replied, "I haven't the energy to steal what is freely given." There was a pause. Clara blinked once. And then, soft laughter, genuine this time, rippled through the group. Even one of the older matrons nodded approvingly, her fan fluttering near her chin. Jonathan's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. His gaze, however, lingered on Louisa with something quiet and deep. Clara, momentarily disarmed, pressed onward. "And tell us, Miss Whitcombe," she purred, "what does one do to captivate a man of steel? We've always heard he preferred iron contracts over conversation." Louisa turned to Jonathan, her expression serene. "I wouldn't presume to speak for Mr. Blackwell," she said, "but I imagine even the strongest walls grow weary of keeping the world out." Jonathan's breath caught before he could stop it. The room shifted again, eyes widened, fans fluttered, and somewhere in the distance someone dropped a teacup. The conversation moved on, but Louisa had already claimed the moment. She sat not as an interloper, not as an object of scandal, but as a woman unafraid of the shadows cast by chandeliers. Later that evening, after the carriages had begun to depart and the gaslights outside flickered in the falling snow, Jonathan and Louisa stood together beneath the great marble arch of the entryway, waiting for the footman to retrieve their coats. "You disarmed them," Jonathan said quietly. "I didn't come to fight," she replied, looking ahead, "only to be seen." He studied her profile, the curve of her cheek, the quiet fire in her eyes. "They saw you." She turned to him then, and something passed between them, unspoken, dangerous, electric. Their hands did not touch, their bodies did not lean, and yet the space between them was suddenly charged with all that had not been said. In that fleeting moment, under the hush of evening and the watchful silence of old marble walls, Jonathan realized something he had not yet dared admit. The alliance he had proposed no longer felt manageable. It felt inevitable. The morning was bleak and grey, the sky layered with low clouds that threatened snow. The city stirred slowly beneath the weight of the season, its streets still slick from the night's frost, the chimneys of factories and row houses already exhaling columns of smoke into the chilled air. It was not a day meant for silks and salons. It was a day built for iron, soot, and truth. Louisa had not expected the invitation. When Jonathan's note arrived, written in his precise hand and delivered before breakfast, it carried no embellishment, no flourish, only a simple request. "If you will permit it, I would like to show you the world that built me." At first, she hesitated. There was something in the phrasing that unsettled her. Not "my world," but "the world that built me," as if he had no ownership over it, only survival, as if it had shaped him with calloused hands and a whip made of fire. She dressed in a tailored navy wool coat with matching gloves and a hat adorned with a single dark feather. It was not a garment for dainty strolls, but for facing something unvarnished. She sensed she would need it. The carriage arrived shortly before 10, and when she stepped into it, Jonathan was already seated, gazing through the window with a distant look she did not recognize. He greeted her with a nod, his eyes momentarily softening as they met hers. "We'll be heading north," he said, voice low. "The main mill is on the outskirts of the city, near the river." Louisa adjusted her gloves. "May I ask why?" He hesitated. "Because I believe, if we are to be seen together, if we are to continue this performance, you deserve to understand what comes with my name." She turned her head slightly, studying him. "Is it a warning, then?" "Perhaps," he said, "or a confession." The journey took nearly an hour. As the city faded into smoke-stained brick and the cobblestones gave way to gravel and mud, Louisa saw a New York she had never known. Here the air was harsher, thicker. The streets were filled with wagons burdened by iron and timber. Children with soot-darkened faces darted between alleys, and the sound of metal upon metal echoed like distant thunder. The mill stood like a fortress against the riverbank, its chimneys tall and blackened, its windows narrow and streaked with grime. The name, Blackwell Ironworks, was etched in weathered stone above the entrance. Louisa stepped down from the carriage, the cold immediately seeping through the soles of her boots. Her eyes widened as she took in the scope of it, the endless clanging, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic pounding of hammers against steel. Men moved like shadows, their shirts soaked with sweat despite the cold, their faces streaked with ash and exhaustion. Jonathan offered his hand. She took it without hesitation. "This," he said over the noise, "is where the elegance of our city is born, not in parlors, not in ballrooms, here in fire and metal." He led her inside. The heat was immediate, oppressive. The roar of furnaces swallowed speech, and the air smelled of coal and rust. Louisa pressed a handkerchief to her nose but said nothing. She watched the men, some barely more than boys, bending over machinery, their movements practiced and precise. They did not glance up. They had no time for curiosity. A foreman approached, and Jonathan spoke with him briefly, his tone respectful but firm. The man nodded and returned to his post. Louisa saw in Jonathan's face a tension she had never seen at soirée or behind lace-draped windows. This was not a man of leisure. This was a man forged by necessity. He turned to her. "Would you like to see the casting floor?" She hesitated. Yes. It was hotter still in the next chamber. Molten metal flowed like lava through narrow channels, and sparks leapt into the air like angry stars. Louisa's heart pounded. The workers wore leather aprons and gloves, their eyes hidden behind smoked glass. One man staggered slightly, his balance faltering, but another caught him, steadying him without a word. She looked at Jonathan. "They're exhausted," he nodded. "They are." She stepped closer to him, her voice low and sharp. "And yet you drive them harder. You take their labor and turn it into wealth, and they remain in the shadows while you are invited to dine with Astors and Vanderbilts." His jaw clenched. "Do you think I do not know that? Do you care?" she asked, not unkindly. He exhaled slowly. "Yes, but caring does not change the reality. They work because they must. I provide because I can." Louisa's gaze did not falter. "There is power in what you choose not to see." He looked at her then, not as a woman in fine gloves and a fashionable coat, but as someone who had pierced a part of him long buried. For a moment he said nothing. "They're paid above the standard," he murmured. "Their families housed, their children schooled. That does not make it just, but it is not as cruel as it was in my father's day." Louisa took a breath. "That is a beginning, not an excuse." They stood in silence as the metal poured behind them, its glow painting their faces in gold and crimson. The noise around them receded, not because it lessened, but because something louder had risen between them. Jonathan turned away first. "I brought you here because I thought you should understand what it means to bear my name. This empire is not built on dreams. It is built on fire and ash and hands that bleed." She stepped closer to him. "And what about your hands, Mr. Blackwell? Do they bleed?" He closed his eyes for the briefest moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "but the scars are older than you know." When they returned to the carriage, the silence between them was heavier, but not cold. Louisa sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the factories retreating into the distance. Finally, she spoke. "Who was she?" Jonathan looked at her, startled. "Who? The woman whose absence still lingers in your voice." His breath caught. For a heartbeat, he looked out the window, and when he returned his gaze to her, there was no defense left in his eyes. "My wife," he said. "Isabel." Louisa said nothing, but her expression softened. "She died 7 years ago," he continued. "Pneumonia. It was sudden. She was gentle, too gentle for this world, for my world." Louisa's voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "And you built a fortress of iron around your grief." He nodded once, unable to speak. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the city's lights returning slowly as they neared Fifth Avenue. But something had shifted. It was no longer an alliance built of strategy. It was something far more fragile and far more dangerous. The Vanderbilt mansion stood illuminated like a cathedral of ambition, each window aglow with golden light that spilled onto Fifth Avenue like molten honey. On this particular evening, the entire edifice pulsed with the life of New York's most coveted gathering, the annual Vanderbilt Masquerade Ball. Carriages lined the avenue for blocks, their lacquered doors opening to reveal women clad in velvet, tulle, and silk, men in tailcoats and polished boots, all masked yet unmistakable in stature. Inside, the air shimmered with perfume, candlelight, and the soft rustle of silk skirts brushing against polished marble. Musicians in the gallery played a Strauss waltz with such precision that it seemed to stir the very bones of the mansion. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, covered in frescoes imported from Florence, while crystal chandeliers the size of carriages rained fractured light across a crowd drunk on power and pretense. Louisa stood near the entrance of the ballroom, her heart a steady thunder beneath her corseted bodice. Her mask, delicately crafted from silver filigree, framed her eyes like a whisper of moonlight. Her gown was a deep garnet velvet trimmed with black lace, severe in cut but rich in texture, chosen not to seduce but to command. Around her neck, a velvet ribbon held a sapphire teardrop, a subtle inheritance from her mother's youth. She had dressed not to compete with debutantes, but to remind the room that she belonged there. Jonathan approached her through the crowd with the calm purpose of a man used to owning every room he entered. He wore a black half-mask, simple and elegant, its edges barely concealing the sharp lines of his jaw and the penetrating weight of his gaze. His dark tailcoat was trimmed in fine embroidery, a nod to the occasion, but the restraint in his attire made him all the more striking. He paused in front of her, and for a moment they simply stood in silence, the music swelling around them. "I had wondered," he said, his voice low enough to be theirs alone, "whether you would come." "I was expected," she replied evenly, "and I no longer shy away from expectations." He offered his arm. "Then allow me to fulfill another." Without a word, she placed her gloved hand atop his, and they made their way to the dance floor, where dozens of masked couples already turned in perfect rhythm beneath the chandeliers. As Jonathan pulled her gently into the waltz, Louisa felt the tension between them tighten, like a string drawn taut. His hand rested at her back with measured pressure, his other clasping hers with a steadiness that betrayed the emotion beneath. Their bodies moved in harmony, yet their thoughts seemed to drift in opposite currents, each one resisting, each one surrendering, every turn of the waltz blurring the line between performance and something achingly real. "Every time I look at you," he said softly, "I see something I did not expect." Louisa's gaze remained forward, her steps precise. "What do you see, Mr. Blackwell?" He hesitated, then said, "The one thing I spent years convincing myself I had no use for, conviction that does not bend to power." She turned her face slightly, her voice measured. "You find it admirable?" "I find it unsettling." They spun once more, her skirts fanning out like petals in bloom. "That," she said, "is the first honest thing you've said all evening." "And yet I have been honest since the beginning," he replied, "only never with myself." She lifted her eyes to his, and for a single moment their masks ceased to matter. The ballroom fell away, the chandeliers dimmed, the music blurred into nothing. In that gaze they met as something more than society's darlings, more than an alliance constructed from convenience. They met as two souls stripped of protection, dangerously close to stepping beyond the roles they had agreed to play. But the spell did not last. Across the ballroom, near the floral columns, Clara Davenport observed them with a stillness that belied the storm inside her. Dressed in a seafoam blue gown and a pearl-dusted mask, she looked the part of a nymph, ethereal and sweet. But beneath the shimmer, her eyes burned with fury. She had grown accustomed to attention, sought, courted, envied. Jonathan Blackwell had never been hers, not truly, but the prospect of his indifference had always been safely in her pocket. Until Louisa. Until the quiet woman with the watchful eyes had begun to capture glances Clara used to claim without effort. It was intolerable. And when Clara's gaze shifted to Mrs. Willoughby, an aging gossip columnist dressed as Marie Antoinette, the plan formed like poison in her mouth. By the following morning, the whispers had already begun. That Miss Whitcombe had orchestrated the courtship from the beginning, that the kiss at Delmonico's had been a trap laid months in advance, that she had cried poverty to gain sympathy, only to ensnare the city's most eligible widower through pity and cunning. They said she had rewritten her history. They said her tears were a performance. They said she had been seen speaking with one of the writers at the Herald, conveniently after her sudden return to society. The rumours flowed like ink in a cracked fountain. Unstoppable and staining, Louisa heard them first from her dressmaker, who whispered with wide eyes as she pinned a new hem. Then from the footman, who stiffened as he opened the front door and could not meet her gaze. By the time the letter arrived, unsigned, ugly and cruel, she no longer needed confirmation. It had begun. When Jonathan called upon her that afternoon, she met him in the drawing room, her shoulders squared, her eyes impossibly calm. "Have you heard?" she asked, without preamble. He stood near the hearth, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. "I have," he said, "and I intend to silence it." She tilted her head. "How? With another dance? Another statement in a ballroom?" "No," he said, more sharply than he intended. "With action." Louisa stepped closer, her voice tightening. "You cannot erase it, Jonathan. They will believe what they want to believe. The truth does not suit them." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the fire rising behind her composure. A fire that would not ask for protection, only space to burn on its own terms. "They believe I schemed for you," she said bitterly, "that I spun gold from ash, that I twisted your grief into infatuation." His expression darkened. "They do not know me." "No," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "but they know me too well, or they think they do." He crossed the room in 2 steps, pausing just before her, their proximity charged with a fury that was not entirely born of pain. "I will not let them ruin you," he said, his voice low and firm. Louisa searched his face, and in that moment she saw not the magnate, not the strategist, not the man forged in iron, but a man whose control was faltering. And somewhere in that fracture, she saw truth. "I am not afraid of them," she whispered. "I am," he replied. The silence that followed was heavy. Their hands did not meet, their lips did not touch, but between them bloomed something more fragile and more binding than a kiss. The beginning of something neither of them dared name. It began, as most destruction does in New York society, with ink. The morning was crisp and cloudless, the sky a brittle blue that promised spring without offering its warmth. Louisa had risen early, stirred not by sunlight but by a feeling, an ache in her chest that arrived before awareness. Something in the air felt off-kilter, like a painting ever so slightly askew. She was seated in the breakfast room, her tea untouched, when the sound of the front door opening broke the silence. A moment later the butler entered with a folded newspaper in hand and a strange stiffness to his manner. He hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to Louisa's face before he placed the paper gently beside her plate. "It arrived just now, miss." She nodded, already reaching for it, but the weight of his pause lingered even after he left the room. The New York Sentinel was not known for its kindness, but its reach was vast and its readership insatiable for scandal. As Louisa unfolded the front page, her heart began to pound, not for what she saw, but for what she already sensed would be there. It was a caricature, crude, grotesque, merciless. A woman with sharp features and hunched shoulders, clearly meant to be Louisa, clung to the arm of a towering gentleman, his pockets bulging with dollar bills. Above them, a headline screamed in exaggerated calligraphy, "The Spinster's Triumph, How to Snare a Titan with Tears and Timing." Below it, the caption read, "When diamonds fail, desperation prevails." The ink blurred as Louisa stared at it, her hands trembling. Her breath caught, shallow and uneven, as though her corset had suddenly tightened to the point of pain. Her vision darkened at the edges, but she forced herself to breathe, to blink, to stay upright. It was not only the mockery, it was the venom, the certainty in the lines that this woman, once invisible, had no right to rise. That her presence beside Jonathan Blackwell was not an accident or affection, but a scheme. A theft of position, a social crime. The teacup shattered in her hand before she realized she had crushed it. That afternoon she refused callers. When Jonathan's carriage arrived, she sent a message that she was indisposed. When flowers came, she did not touch them. When his second note arrived, she did not read it. She sat in her parlor with the newspaper folded beside her like a wound that would not stop bleeding. It was not the scandal she feared. It was the seed of doubt it planted. That night, long after the city had drawn its curtains against the cold, Jonathan Blackwell stormed into the private dining hall of the Waldorf Club, where three of his rivals sat in self-satisfied elegance, their brandy glasses catching the flickering gaslight like polished mirrors. He said nothing at first. They turned slowly, the smugness fading from their expressions as they took in the fury in his eyes. "Which one of you paid for it?" he asked, his voice low, deadly. Charles Ellery, an aging financier with thinning blonde hair and a penchant for cowardice, shifted uncomfortably. Beside him, Thomas Royce, the newspaper magnate with a fox-like face and perfumed wrists, gave a slow smile. "You'll have to be more specific, Blackwell," Royce said. "There's so much to choose from." Jonathan stepped forward, planting both hands on the polished table. "I don't care which one of you wrote the check. I want the name of the editor, the printer, and the messenger boy who carried it." "Ah," Royce murmured, swirling his brandy. "So it did strike a nerve." Ellery cleared his throat. "Come now, Jonathan. Surely you know how the game is played." Jonathan's eyes blazed. "No. You think I've forgotten, but I haven't. I clawed my way into this city with iron and blood. I've paid more in silence than any of you could in gold. But I will not let you touch her." Royce raised a brow. "Then perhaps you should reconsider the arrangement. She was never meant for our world. She doesn't know how to bleed politely." Jonathan's fist slammed into the table, rattling the decanter. "She is worth more than this entire room." The silence that followed was thick and pulsing. He straightened, smoothing his coat with deliberate control. "And if another word, another line, so much as glances her name again, I will buy your paper, your houses, and your legacies, and burn them to ash." Without another word, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing with finality. But his rage did nothing to soften the storm inside Louisa. In the days that followed, she withdrew. From society, from invitations, from him. Her mother, bewildered and helpless, offered vague reassurances and stiff brandy, but Louisa no longer heard them. Her world had narrowed into a single question that rang louder than the rest. Had any of it been real? When Jonathan stood beside her, had it been for her or against them? Did he see her as a partner or a pawn? One evening, unable to sleep, she stood before her mirror in a gown she had not worn in years. Soft rose silk, youthful in its elegance. She had sewn it herself in a different life, when she still believed in second chances, in poetry, in kindness. Now it looked like a costume from a forgotten play. Her reflection stared back at her with eyes shadowed by weariness, but unbroken. She whispered to it, "I will not be their entertainment. I will not be his shield." And somewhere across the city, Jonathan sat alone in his study, staring into the fire, her name etched behind his eyes with a pain he could not extinguish. He had given her the truth, but he feared it had come too late. The snow returned to New York with sudden fury, blanketing the city in white silence and erasing the sharp lines of carriages and street lamps beneath a veil of winter. Fifth Avenue, so often gilded with the gleam of fashion and pretense, now resembled a ghost of itself. The trees stood skeletal and unmoving, and the gaslights flickered like distant stars in the thickening dusk. Inside the Whitcombe residence, a fire burned low in the drawing room, casting long shadows across the walls. The warmth did little to comfort Louisa, who stood by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes descend. She had not left the house in 3 days, not since the caricature, not since the silence from Jonathan had grown too loud to ignore. She heard the door open behind her and closed her eyes before she turned. Jonathan entered without ceremony, snow clinging to the shoulders of his greatcoat, his boots heavy with the weight of the street. He looked older than he had a week ago. The tension in his brow, the exhaustion in his posture, betrayed more than business fatigue. It was the strain of restraint, of wanting to speak, to reach, and not knowing how. Louisa did not move. Her voice was calm, but each word fell with the precision of a blade. "I asked not to be disturbed." "I am not a disturbance," he replied, his tone low. "I am the man whose name you wear in every whispered insult." She turned to him slowly, her eyes sharp despite the dimness. Do I wear it, Mr. Blackwell, or has it been used to cover me like a cloak, only to keep the world from seeing what you truly are? His jaw tightened. You are angry. I am humiliated, she corrected. And more than that, I am disillusioned. Jonathan stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away, as if to shorten the distance might erase the wound. I've done what I could to protect you. Her laugh, soft and bitter, echoed off the marble hearth. Is that what you believe this has been? Protection? Then you see me as helpless, as someone to shield and not someone to stand beside. That is not true, isn't it? She whispered. The fire cracked beside them, the only sound between breaths. I didn't ask for this, Louisa continued, her voice trembling with fury she barely managed to contain. Not the scandal, not the attention, and certainly not your charity. If I've become a symbol in the war between magnates, then I was never more than a pawn in your carefully managed life. He stepped forward then, the ice in his eyes melting into something raw. You think I've managed this? That I've been in control? Since the day I kissed you, everything I understood about power has begun to slip through my fingers. You speak of charity, when I have given you more of myself than I have given to anyone since Isabel died. Her breath caught at the name. It was the first time he had spoken it aloud in her presence. His voice cracked. You say you were humiliated, and what do you imagine I have felt standing silent while the world questions whether I am a fool for choosing a woman they once forgot existed? Louisa's heart pounded, but she held her ground. Then why choose me? Why persist? Was it pity, Jonathan, or guilt, or simply the need to win a battle you didn't even know you were fighting? He did not answer, not immediately. Instead, he turned his face slightly, as though the weight of her gaze was suddenly too much to bear. I don't know, he said finally. I only know that I cannot stop thinking of you. Not when I rise, not when I work, not when I try to sleep. You haunt me, not because you are perfect, but because you are real. Silence fell between them like snow outside the window, soft, blanketing, cold. Louisa looked at him, and for the first time since their alliance began, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. And yet I am tired, she said. Tired of defending my worth, of holding my chin above waters that society keeps trying to drown me in. I am tired of performing, of pretending. I never wanted to belong to this world, Jonathan, only to be seen in it as something more than a cautionary tale. His eyes searched hers, desperation flickering behind their steel. Then don't leave, he said. Not like this. But she shook her head gently. I've written to my cousin in Boston. They've offered me work at the women's college. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. His expression faltered. You're going? I'm considering it, she replied, because for the first time in years I have remembered that I can choose for myself. And if all I am to you is a shield against your loneliness, then I would rather fade into obscurity on my own terms than be paraded as your regret. Jonathan took a slow step toward her, his voice low, urgent. You are not my regret. She looked away, the storm in her chest too loud to quiet with a glance. No, she whispered. I am your complication. And he had no reply. He left a few minutes later, his gloved hand lingering on the door as though it resisted being pulled away. Snow fell around him as he descended the steps, but he didn't notice. Inside, Louisa stood by the window again, watching his figure disappear into the whiteness. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, her reflection pale against the dark. She had once believed herself invisible. Now she feared she had become unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. And as the snow thickened, burying the city in silence once more, neither of them knew whether this breaking point would mark their end or the painful beginning of something truer than either had dared to hope. The snow had melted from the edges of the rooftops, leaving the city glazed in glass and damp stone. Spring had not yet arrived, but winter's grasp had weakened, its breath no longer so cruel. New York stirred beneath pale skies, its carriages rumbling with renewed urgency, and its avenues glistening with the thaw of transformation. Inside the Whitcombe residence, however, time had refused to move. Louisa sat at her writing desk, a blank page resting before her, the ink in her pen untouched. Her thoughts had wandered to Boston again. Its quieter pace, its academic air, the offer of a teaching position that promised solitude, purpose, and a retreat from scandal. Her cousin's last letter lay folded neatly beside her, waiting for a reply. It had arrived with kind words and a simple sentence that echoed louder than the rest. "You are not a woman who belongs in the shadows." But Louisa no longer knew where she belonged. Not in the whispers of New York's ballrooms, not in Jonathan Blackwell's empire of steel and silence, and certainly not in a future built on the uncertain terrain of emotions neither of them had dared to name. She heard the front door open, then quick footsteps, a brief exchange between the butler and her mother in the hallway, urgent but hushed. Moments later, her parlor door opened. Jonathan stood there, hat in hand, his coat dusted with wind and determination. His eyes met hers across the room, and there was no preamble, no formality, only the tension of everything that had been left unsaid. Louisa rose slowly, her heart steady, but her voice no longer willing to shield itself. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "I had to." Her lips pressed into a line. "Have you come to explain what cannot be undone?" "No," he said, stepping inside. "I've come to speak the truth that should have been spoken long ago." She said nothing, only watched him as he removed his gloves and placed them carefully on the nearby table, as though any gesture less precise would betray how tightly he held himself together. Jonathan's voice, when he spoke again, was low, hoarse, with something far more dangerous than anger: honesty. "That night at Delmonico's, when I kissed your hand in front of them all, it wasn't strategy, it wasn't pity, and it certainly wasn't meant to begin this cruel parade." He moved closer, the distance between them closing with slow reverence. "I kissed you," he said, "because you were the only person in that room who stood with dignity while the world tried to crush her. Because I saw strength where others saw a woman past her prime. Because in the moment they laughed, I realized I could no longer be silent." Louisa's breath caught. The silence between them now pulsed with something raw, something fragile. He continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have made a life out of calculation, out of knowing when to act, when to wait, when to retreat. But I did not calculate you. You happened to me like a storm." She turned slightly, her hands twisting in the folds of her skirt. "Then why did you let them speak about me as if I were a convenience, as if I had wrapped myself around your fortune like ivy on stone?" His voice cracked. "Because I was afraid." She faced him fully now. "Of what?" "Of needing you." "Baradiki." The words struck her like a chord, reverberating through everything she had built to keep her heart safe. "I buried a woman I loved," he said, his voice breaking under the weight of memory. "I built walls of iron around that grief and called it strength. But you remind me of everything I once dared to feel, and everything I swore I would never risk again." Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "And yet you came." He nodded once. "Because losing you to their cruelty would be easier than living with myself for letting you walk away." A long silence followed. The only sound was the distant ticking of the mantel clock, marking the moment as if even time had paused to listen. Louisa stepped forward, not out of surrender, but because her heart no longer allowed stillness. "I never wanted to be saved," she whispered, "only to be chosen." Jonathan reached for her then, not with desperation but with a reverence so deep it trembled in his fingertips. "I choose you," he said, "not for appearances, not for strategy, but because without you every room is too quiet, every victory too hollow, and every breath too difficult to draw." Louisa let herself breathe again, truly breathe for the first time in days, but she still held her ground. Then no more hiding, no more games. If we walk into that ballroom again, it will not be for society, it will be for us. Jonathan met her gaze with a quiet fire. Agreed. She studied him for a moment longer, searching for the shadows, for the remnants of pride or pity, but they were gone. What remained was a man no longer trying to command the world, but daring for once to be vulnerable within it. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops of Fifth Avenue, Louisa sat once more at her writing desk. The blank page still lay before her, but instead of replying to Boston, she folded the letter gently and placed it in the drawer. Outside, the first stars began to flicker against the dusk. Inside, a choice had been made, and for the first time in her life, Louisa Whitcombe had not been granted a place. She had claimed one. The ballroom of the Whitmore estate glowed with a brilliance designed to outshine memory itself. The chandeliers, dripping with hundreds of hand-cut crystals, refracted the candlelight like sunlight striking snow. Silk-clad figures drifted across the floor in slow, calculated movements, each one choreographed by the invisible rules of a world built on lineage, whispers, and unyielding perception. Laughter echoed behind lace fans. Champagne sparkled in crystal flutes. The orchestra played a sweeping waltz that stirred nostalgia for a past that never truly existed. It was the final ball of the season, a culmination of appearances, alliances, and ambition, and every eye in the room had turned in expectation toward the grand staircase. Louisa stood alone at the top of it, still and poised, her gown a deep shade of ivory, tinged with gold thread, its silhouette both elegant and unflinching, the bodice curved with quiet strength, the sleeves falling delicately from her shoulders in a fashion more daring than dramatic. Her dark hair, swept into a low twist, was pinned with a single sapphire comb, a reflection of the night sky she had so often watched from behind her bedroom window. She descended slowly, unhurried by the stir her entrance caused. Conversations fell to murmurs. Fans slowed mid-wave, some turned away in disdain, others leaned forward with curious hunger. But no one looked through her now. Louisa Whitcombe was no longer invisible. Across the room, Jonathan stood near the marble fireplace, his profile unreadable, the line of his jaw tense beneath the weight of anticipation. He was dressed in a black tailcoat with a white cravat knotted perfectly beneath his chin, but nothing about him tonight felt stiff or rehearsed. He looked like a man holding back a storm he had no intention of hiding. He watched her descend without blinking. Their eyes met halfway across the ballroom, and for a moment the air shifted. Not a sound, not a movement, just that subtle shift when two people lock eyes and a room forgets to breathe. Louisa made her way toward him, weaving through the guests like a ghost finally come to claim her place among the living. Jonathan stepped forward, offering his hand. She took it. Their fingers barely touched, but the tension in that contact was palpable, electric. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice low, steady, and meant only for her. "Mr. Blackwell," she answered, her smile faint but real. They moved onto the floor as the orchestra changed its tune. A new waltz began, soft and lilting, full of restraint and longing. As they began to dance, the room shifted again. Not with shock this time, but with awareness. There was no performance now, no calculated steps for the sake of society, only two people tethered by a truth neither could escape. The dance was slow, intimate. His hand at her waist was firm but reverent. Her fingertips rested lightly against his shoulder. Their gazes never parted. The world might have spun around them, but they moved in a gravity of their own. And then came the voice. "Some things," Clara Davenport announced from the edge of the floor, "cannot be erased with fine silken sympathy." Her tone was light, but every word was aimed with the precision of a blade. Louisa turned slightly, still within the dance, still held by Jonathan's arm. The crowd quieted. A circle formed. There, framed in soft lamplight and venomous confidence, stood Clara in a gown of emerald and diamonds, her lips curved in a smile too sharp to be innocent. Society may forgive quickly, she continued, but it never forgets desperation, nor schemes dressed as redemption. A hush fell over the room like falling snow. Louisa felt the sting, not from Clara's words, but from the memory they tried to summon. The caricature, the whispers, the ache of humiliation still tender beneath her ribs. But she did not lower her gaze. Jonathan stopped dancing. He turned to face Clara, his hand never leaving Louisa's. "You're correct," he said, his voice ringing clear, composed as steel. "Society remembers everything." He stepped forward slowly, bringing Louisa with him, not shielding her but standing at her side as equal. "So let it remember this." He paused, scanning the room, meeting every gaze that dared look back. And then, with the calm of a man who had once built cities from soot and silence, he spoke. "I intend to marry Louisa Whitcombe." A ripple passed through the ballroom like thunder muffled in velvet. "I do not offer her my name to repair a scandal," he continued. "I offer it because I love her, because in a world of empty performances and carefully constructed masks, she has been the only truth I have known in years." Louisa's breath caught. He turned toward her then slowly, deliberately, and met her eyes. "If she will have me," he said softly, "I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of her." For a moment there was nothing, no applause, no murmurs, just silence. And then Mrs. Astor's fan clicked shut. From the far side of the room, the Queen of Society tilted her head in acknowledgement. A small gesture, but one that echoed louder than any trumpet. And then the crowd began to shift, not in scandal but in quiet respect. Heads dipped, fans fluttered again. The current of the room changed direction. Clara stood frozen, her smile hollowing, her voice gone. Louisa turned toward Jonathan, and the world narrowed to the space between them. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward and kissed him, not with performance, not with restraint, but with truth. A kiss that no longer belonged to rumor or rebellion. A kiss that belonged to love. The room exhaled, and then, slowly, the music resumed. As they stood there, still locked in that quiet moment, Louisa felt a warmth bloom in her chest, not from Jonathan's arms, nor from the flickering chandeliers, but from within herself. From the certainty that this path had not been given to her. She had carved it step by painful step. She had not been saved. She had saved herself. And now, as the orchestra swelled and guests resumed their dance, she walked forward not as the woman society had discarded, but as the one it would never again forget. Louisa Whitcombe had not become someone's wife. She had become herself. New York, spring of 1889. The city had grown taller, louder, more restless. Steel stretched toward the sky, railways stitched the boroughs like veins, and fortunes rose and fell with the quiet thunder of progress. But nestled on the edge of Central Park, past rows of horse-drawn carriages and under a canopy of blooming dogwoods, the Blackwell townhouse remained unchanged, its stone facade dignified, its windows open to the sunlight, and its halls filled with a different kind of wealth. Inside, the scent of lilacs and ink drifted gently through the rooms. Louisa sat at her writing desk by the window, a book open before her, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a silk ribbon pressed between the pages. Outside, laughter echoed from the garden. Light, bright, belonging to children whose worlds had never known shame or whispered cruelty. A boy of 6, dark-haired and steady-eyed, chased a smaller girl across the lawn. She was 4, all curls and defiance, her laughter shrill with victory as she escaped his grasp and darted behind the rose bushes. Their governess called after them, but neither slowed. Jonathan stood near the garden steps, his hands behind his back, his silver-threaded hair catching the late afternoon light. He watched them with the quiet pride of a man who had spent a lifetime carving his world out of stone and had finally learned to let it soften. When Louisa joined him, her hand slipping easily into his, he turned toward her with the same look he had once worn across ballrooms and drawing rooms, back when he was still learning how to love. They had married within a month of that final ball, not out of haste, but out of clarity. The scandal faded quickly, replaced by fascination, then admiration, and in time, reverence. Louisa's name became one spoken not with pity, but with pride. She had not only defied expectation, she had redrawn its borders. She had published 2 essays in the North American Review, challenging the limitations placed on women of a certain age. She had begun hosting salons in her home, not for gossip, but for discourse. Women of intelligence and wit came in droves, many of whom had once avoided her at parties. Jonathan had expanded his mills, but also his conscience. Working conditions improved, education funds were established, and the Blackwell name, once synonymous with power, became equally linked to reform. The fortress he had built with iron had been softened, not weakened, by her presence. They had lost a child once, a daughter born too early in their 2nd year of marriage. That grief had nearly broken them. But it became another thread in the fabric of their bond, one woven through with pain, resilience, and the decision to stay, always, even when staying was hard. Clara Davenport had married a French nobleman with a thinning title and a love for cards. By the 3rd year, he had vanished into Europe with half her dowry. Clara returned to New York briefly, but the invitations had stopped coming. She lived now in seclusion upstate, her name forgotten in the parlors she once ruled. Some said she had become a patroness of local charities. Others said she drank her evenings away, surrounded by fading gowns. But Louisa never spoke ill of her. Time had already delivered its justice. Mrs. Astor continued to host her famed 400, though whispers had begun of new names, new rules. A younger generation of women no longer measured worth by lineage alone. Louisa's story, once ridiculed, was now cited by mothers as proof that strength, not submission, shaped destiny. As the sun dipped low behind the park, casting long shadows over the grass, Jonathan turned to Louisa and spoke softly. "Do you regret it? This life?" She smiled at him, her eyes filled with the calm that comes only after storms have passed. "No," she said. "I only regret that I feared it for so long." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed it gently, the same way he had 7 years ago before either of them understood what such a gesture could mean. The children came running toward them then, breathless and bright. The girl climbed into Louisa's arms without ceremony. The boy stood proudly at Jonathan's side, looking up at him with an expression that mirrored his father's more than either of them realized. And there, beneath the blooming lilacs with laughter in the air and spring in full bloom, Louisa Whitcombe, once forgotten, once dismissed, stood not only as a wife or a mother, but as a woman who had rewritten her place in the world. Her story was no longer whispered, it was remembered, and it had endured. When society turned its back on Louisa Whitcombe, she stood tall. When whispers sought to tear her down, she answered with dignity. And when love came, not as a rescue, but as a recognition of her worth, she embraced it with courage. This is more than a story of romance. It is a reminder that no voice should be silenced by age, no dream should be dismissed by status, and no heart is ever too late to bloom. In a world that often defines women by the expectations of others, Louisa rewrote the rules, and in doing so, reminded us all that resilience is a quiet revolution. If this story touched your heart, let it travel further. Share it with someone who still believes, or needs to believe, that strength and love are not opposites, but soulmates. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word resilient in the comments, so I know you're part of this beautiful journey. Your support helps stories like this reach others who need them. There are more tales waiting for you, of love, of strength, of women who defied the world and found themselves. You can find them in the cards right above. Go ahead. Let your heart travel a little further.